Hi everyone, this is the lecture for the nervous system on reflexes, and the essential question we're answering is how do reflexes work? So by the end of this lecture you should be able to answer that question using the vocabulary terms on the right side. The three things we're going to talk about here are what is a reflex and what are types of reflexes, what are the elements of a reflex arc, and we're going to differentiate between the classic reflex arc and a simple reflex arc. Just to recap, remember that most of the neurons that we're discussing in this unit are multipolar. So you have the soma on the left, you've got the dendrites that receive signals coming out from it, and then those signals go down the axon, which is this nerve projection on the right, until it reaches the axon terminals, where those signals then will jump across the synapse to the next neuron. So a reflex is basically a rapid, predictable, involuntary response to stimuli, and a lot of the communication that happens in your body is going to be done through reflexes. So a lot of the things that you do are reflexive. You do them without thinking or without making the decision to do them. And reflexes always occur in the same manner, using the same neural pathways for both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So they're called reflex arcs. There are two functional types of reflexes. There's somatic reflexes, which are the ones that stimulate skeletal muscles, and there's autonomic reflexes, which are the ones that regulate smooth and cardiac muscles and glands. So for example, if you accidentally put your hand on a hot object, you're going to pull it away reflexively. If you go to the optometrist, then one of the things they do is they put a burst of air at your eye to check your blink reflex. So those are somatic reflexes. They're controlled by the voluntary skeletal muscles. Autonomic reflexes are the ones that regulate smooth and cardiac muscles and glands. So one example would be the secretion of saliva. It's not something that you have to conscientiously do. It automatically happens when you have food in your mouth or when you smell, stimulating, delicious smell. Another example would be the regulation of your heartbeat. And so that happens reflexively, and your heart rate will change reflexively according to different situations, like if you are under stress or if you're relaxing. And then another example would be change in pupil size. So when the light is brighter, your pupils reflexively contract to diminish the amount of light going in. And when the light is dimmer, then your pupils reflexively enlarge to allow more light to go in. In general, most reflex arcs have at least 5 elements, and this is the pattern in which you'll find them. So first is the sensory receptor, which is the part of the neural pathway that reacts to the stimulus. So for example, if you had a pinprick in your skin, like you got a splinter or something, here you have the stimulus, right? That would be the pin that's pricking you. And then right underneath your skin, you would have the sensory receptor. So that sensory receptor is going to send information down the sensory neuron. So here's the sensory neuron shown in blue. And the sensory neuron is the neuron that connects the receptor in your skin, in this case, to the central nervous system. And remember, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. And here what you see is a cross-section of the spinal cord. So the sensory neuron is connecting the sensory receptor under your skin, the one that receives the pain signal, and that pain signal is traveling over here to your spine. Next, you have the integration center. So the integration center is going to be composed of one or more interneurons. So these are neurons that are specialized to connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. And so that is shown in green here. It's an interneuron, part of the integration center. And you'll notice that the interneuron is inside of your central nervous system. So in this case, it's in the spinal cord right here. That interneuron is going to receive information from the sensory neuron and transfer it to the motor neuron. And then here in red, the motor neuron, that's the fourth element, connects the central nervous system to the effector. And the effector in this case is a skeletal muscle in your hand that's going to contract when it gets stimulated by the motor neuron, and that's going to pull your hand away from the stimulus, like the thing that pricked you. So let's take a look at this example here. We've got a weight that's being dropped into this person's hand, and that weight is going to then cause the hand to pull down, and then the hand will reflexively come back up again. Now I want you to notice that in this example, we've got the bicep muscle here, the bicep brachii, which is going to elongate when the weight is dropped down. That's going to pull the muscle, and then it's going to contract to right your hand back again at a right angle. So what's the stimulus in this example, and what's the motor response? So you should realize the stimulus is the weight. When the weight drops into the hand, that's going to pull the muscle, and so that stretch in the muscle is the stimulus. And then what's the motor response? The muscle is going to contract, and that's going to bring the hand back up. Okay, so at this point, it would be a good idea for you to pause the video and see if you can identify what are all of these elements in this reflex arc. And in a few seconds, I will tell you what the answers are. All right, so first of all, you have a candle. That's your stimulus, and it is a painful heat source if you touch it. And so here you have your hand, and in your hand you have the sensory receptor that would go off if your fingers touched the candle flame. That sensory information from the sensory receptor will then travel through this red neuron, which would be the sensory neuron, and it would synapse right here with this green neuron, which would be the interneuron. And I want you to recognize, by the way, that when you see in these models, when you see that circle will always represent the soma with all of its dendrites of the neuron that we're talking about. Okay, so this green one is the interneuron, which you can see will synapse right here. There are its axon terminals with the dendrites at the soma of the blue neuron, and that blue neuron is the motor neuron, and it's going to connect right here at its axon terminals to this skeletal muscle right here. This is your triceps brachii, which will then stimulate it to contract, and that should move your hand away from the flame. You'll also notice, by the way, that right here, this interneuron not only synapses with the motor neuron, but it also sends another branch of its axon up the spinal cord to the brain, so that your brain is notified that all of this has happened. And so you're going to have a reflexive response, and then after the response has occurred, your brain will process that information so that you'll know that your hand touched the flame, it hurt, and you moved your hand away. We're going to contrast that reflex arc with the simple reflex here. And one great example of the simple reflex is the patellar reflex, also known as the knee-jerk reflex. So you can see here, this is one of the tests that doctors do with pretty much everyone, but also with newborn babies. And so the doctor is using his rubber mallet to tap on the patella, right, the kneecap of this baby, and then he's checking to see if the baby's lower leg kicks out in response to that. So that's called the patellar knee-jerk reflex. So what's happening here? Well, first of all, when he taps, if you guys can see on this little GIF right here, when the doctor taps on the baby's patellar tendon, then that causes the tendon to stretch. So that stretch is going to be perceived by stretch receptors, which will then send a signal down the sensory neuron right here, where then the sensory neuron synapses with the motor neuron in the spinal cord right here, which then sends an action potential through the motor neuron to the effector organ right here, which is the muscle, the skeletal muscle. And when the skeletal muscle right here receives that signal, it will contract, which then causes the baby's leg to kick out. Notice that in this reflex, the simple reflex, there are only two neurons in this pathway. There's the sensory neuron here, there's the motor neuron here. There is only one synapse between them, so just one synapse between the sensory and the motor neuron, and so this is called a monosynaptic reflex arc. What are we missing in this reflex arc compared to the classic one? We're missing the interneuron. So there is no central neuron in the central nervous system that's connecting these two together. It is an immediate, quick, reflexive response that's important for things like, survival if your life is in danger, or athletic reflexes, or things like that. So we're now going to contrast the simple reflex, which is going to be shown here on the left of this diagram, against the classic reflex, which is shown at the right of the diagram. And let's start with the simple reflex. So we have a rubber mallet hitting the patellar tendon, which then causes a stretch receptor to send a signal down the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, where it synapses with the motor neuron that then signals this quadriceps muscle here to contract, which then causes this to kick out. I think I might have misnamed this muscle in the previous slide. If I did that, I apologize. Over here, contrast that with the classic reflex arc. So we have a stimulus here, sensory neuron takes the information from the receptor, synapses at the spinal cord with an interneuron, shown in green. And you'll notice in this diagram, the interneuron is called an association neuron. So you should know it by both words, but for my class at Pacifica High School, I'm going to use the word interneuron pretty much exclusively. This will then synapse with the red motor neuron, which then causes a contraction of the effector, and the effector in this case is the biceps brachii muscle, which causes your hand to be pulled away from the stimulus. A lot of times people will use the word reflex to talk about like any quick action. Just to be clear, in this class the word reflex refers to reflex arc and those 5 elements. It doesn't refer to like people being a super dad and catching their babies when they fall down, although a lot of that is going to involve reflexive responses as well. So here are your key takeaways. Reflexes are rapid, predictable, involuntary responses to stimuli. Reflexes can be somatic, so they can cause reflexes that trigger skeletal muscle to contract, or they can be autonomic, so these might be reflexes that cause cardiac or smooth muscle to contract. Either way, though, they are involuntary. Most reflexes or reflex arcs have 5 elements: the sensory receptor, the sensory neuron, the interneuron, the motor neuron, and the effector organ. But simple reflex arcs may be monosynaptic, where sensory neurons synapsing directly with motor neurons immediately elicit a motor response. What I'd like you to do is just take a few seconds and answer this essential question. So pause the video. How do reflexes work? And if you can answer that question using all of the vocabulary shown here, then you have probably mastered this concept.